The basket slipped from Rosa Fletcher's fingers, spilling wildflowers across the meadow grass as she looked up into the bluest eyes she had ever seen, belonging to a man who stood there like he had grown from the earth itself, dusty and golden in the afternoon sun. "I apologize, miss," the cowboy said, removing his hat to reveal sun-streaked hair that fell just past his collar. "Didn't mean to startle you. I've been watching you collect those flowers for the better part of an hour, and I thought to myself that maybe you could add one more thing to your basket." Rosa's heart hammered in her chest as she straightened, her fingers still trembling from the surprise. The Nevada heat pressed down on them both, making the air shimmer above the wildflower meadow that stretched between Unionville and the mountains beyond. It was June of 1876, and she had come out here seeking solitude after another disagreement with her father about her future. At 22, she was considered dangerously close to spinsterhood by the town's standards, but Rosa had no interest in marrying any of the miners or merchants her father kept parading through their parlor. "Add what exactly?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The cowboy's mouth curved into a smile that made something flutter deep in her stomach. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and hands that looked capable of both gentleness and strength. "Well, miss, I was thinking you might pick me too. I'm growing wild out here, just like these flowers, and I've been needing someone to notice me for quite some time." Rosa felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Nevada sun. The audacity of this stranger, approaching her in the middle of nowhere with such a forward declaration. Yet something in his voice suggested vulnerability beneath the boldness, a loneliness that echoed her own. "That's quite presumptuous of you, mister," she said, bending to retrieve her basket and the scattered blooms. "You don't even know my name." "Then tell me," he said, dropping to his knees to help her gather the flowers. His hands were careful with the delicate stems, and she noticed calluses on his palms from hard work. "I'm Preston Thorne, and I work at the cattle ranch about 5 miles north of here. I came into town today to pick up supplies, but I saw you walking out toward the meadow with your basket, and something told me to follow." "You followed me?" Rosa asked, though she found herself more intrigued than alarmed. Preston's expression turned sheepish as he handed her a cluster of purple lupines. "When you say it like that, it sounds concerning. I kept my distance, and I was going to leave you be, truly. But then I saw you standing there among all these wildflowers, looking like you belonged to this place more than any cultivated garden, and I thought about how I feel the same way. Wild, untamed, hoping someone might see value in that." Rosa studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. She had learned to be cautious with men, especially after watching her mother's friend Martha end up in a miserable marriage to a man who had courted her with pretty words, but revealed his true nature after the wedding. But Preston's eyes held an honesty that was difficult to fake, and his hands trembled slightly as he held out the flowers to her. "Rosa Fletcher," she finally said, accepting the lupines. "My father owns the general store in Unionville. I come out here when I need to think, when the town feels too small and suffocating." "I know the feeling," Preston said quietly. "I grew up in Missouri, came west after my parents died of fever 5 years ago. I was 19 and alone, figured I'd make my own way. Ended up working cattle, moving from ranch to ranch until I settled at the McAllister place. It's good work, honest work, but it's lonely. Most days I only talk to cows and my horse." They stood there in the meadow, surrounded by yellow balsam root and red Indian paintbrush, the wind carrying the scent of sage from the hills. Rosa felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that seemed to transcend logic. This man, this stranger, understood the particular kind of loneliness that came from being surrounded by people, but feeling fundamentally unseen. "I should get back before my father sends someone looking for me," Rosa said, though she found herself reluctant to leave. "He worries when I'm gone too long, though he never seems to worry about whether I'm happy." Preston's jaw tightened. What father wouldn't want his daughter's happiness? "One who sees daughters as assets to be married off to the highest bidder," Rosa said, surprised by her own bitterness. "Or at least to someone respectable who can provide grandchildren and social standing." "And what do you want?" Preston asked, his blue eyes intense on hers. The question caught Rosa off guard. Nobody had asked her that before, not directly. They had told her what she should want, what any proper young woman would want, but never simply asked what lived in her own heart. "I want to feel like I'm living my own life," she said slowly. "I want to wake up each morning and feel like the day belongs to me, not to someone else's expectations. I want to love someone who sees me as a whole person, not just a pretty ornament or a means to an end." Preston nodded slowly, and she saw understanding in his expression. "I'd like to see you again, Rosa Fletcher. Not to court you the traditional way with chaperoned visits in your father's parlor, but to actually know you. Would you come back to this meadow tomorrow? Same time?" Rosa knew she should refuse. Meeting a man alone without proper supervision was exactly the kind of behavior that would scandalize Unionville's gossips and infuriate her father. But something in her chest pulled tight with longing, a desire to step outside the rigid boundaries that had constrained her entire life. "I'll be here," she said. Preston's smile transformed his face, revealing a joy that made him look younger and more vulnerable. "I'll count the hours until then." Rosa walked back toward Unionville with her basket of wildflowers, her mind spinning with what had just happened. She had spoken more honestly with Preston Thorne in 15 minutes than she had with anyone in months. The connection between them felt both impossible and inevitable, like wildflowers blooming in unlikely soil. When she reached the edge of town, she slowed her pace and tried to compose her expression. The sun hung lower in the western sky, painting the desert landscape in shades of amber and rose. Unionville spread before her, a collection of wooden buildings and dusty streets that had grown up around silver mining and cattle ranching. It was a practical town, built for survival rather than beauty, though Rosa had always found a certain charm in its rough edges. Her father was standing on the porch of their store when she approached, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. James Fletcher was a large man with graying hair and a perpetual frown that had deepened since Rosa's mother died 3 years ago. He had become more controlling after that loss, as if afraid that Rosa would slip away too if he didn't hold tight enough. "You've been gone nearly 3 hours," he said as she climbed the steps. "I was about to send Tom Brewer to look for you." The mention of Tom Brewer made Rosa's stomach turn. Tom was the son of the town's wealthiest mine owner, a man in his early 30s who had made his interest in Rosa abundantly clear. He was handsome enough, she supposed, with dark hair and a well-trimmed mustache, but his eyes held a coldness that frightened her. Her father, however, saw only Tom's money and connections. "I was just collecting flowers, Papa," Rosa said, holding up her basket as evidence. "There's no need to send anyone after me. I'm perfectly capable of walking to the meadow and back." "A young woman shouldn't be wandering around alone," her father said gruffly. "It's not safe and it's not proper. Tom Brewer has asked permission to call on you tomorrow evening. I told him yes." Rosa's fingers tightened on the basket handle. "You might have asked me first. I'm your father. I don't need to ask permission to make decisions about your welfare. I'm 22 years old, Papa. I should have some say in who courts me." Her father's expression hardened. Your mother was married at 19 and grateful for it. You're being stubborn and foolish, Rosa. Tom Brewer is a good match, better than you're likely to get at your age. Half the eligible men in this territory already have wives. Rosa felt tears of frustration burn behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had learned long ago that crying only made her father more dismissive of her concerns. "I won't marry a man I don't love." Love, her father scoffed. Love comes with time and commitment. You think your mother and I were head over heels when we married. We grew to care for each other, built a life together. That's what matters. But Rosa remembered the sadness in her mother's eyes, the way she would stare out the window at the mountains as if dreaming of escape. Her parents had been cordial with each other, respectful even, but Rosa had never seen the kind of passion or deep affection that she imagined love should contain. She excused herself and went inside, carrying her basket up to her small bedroom on the second floor. The room was simply furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. But Rosa had made it her own with curtains she had sewn herself and watercolor paintings of the landscape. She arranged the wildflowers in a blue glass vase and set them on the windowsill where they caught the last rays of sunlight. That night, sleep came slowly. Rosa kept thinking about Preston Thorne, about the way he had looked at her like she was something rare and valuable. She thought about his words, about growing wild and needing to be picked, about the loneliness he carried that matched her own. Part of her warned that she was being foolish, that she knew nothing about this man beyond a brief conversation in a meadow. But another part, deeper and more insistent, told her that some connections transcended logic and caution. The next day seemed to stretch endlessly. Rosa helped her father in the store, measuring out flour and sugar, cutting fabric, tallying accounts. Every task felt tedious, her mind constantly drifting to the meadow and the man who would be waiting there. She wore her blue calico dress, the one that brought out the amber flecks in her brown eyes and braided her dark hair in a crown around her head. "You're looking awful fancy for a Wednesday afternoon," her father commented as she prepared to leave with her basket after the store closed. "I'm just going to collect more flowers," Rosa said, trying to keep her voice casual. "The ones from yesterday are already starting to wilt in this heat." Her father grunted, but didn't object, already distracted by the account books spread across the counter. Rosa slipped out before he could reconsider, her heart hammering with a mixture of excitement and guilt. Preston was already there when she arrived, sitting in the tall grass with his hat beside him. He stood quickly when he saw her approaching, and the smile that lit his face made Rosa's breath catch. "You came," he said, and she heard relief in his voice. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I was afraid you'd reconsider. That you'd decide meeting a strange cowboy in a meadow was too reckless." Rosa set down her basket and settled onto the grass beside where he had been sitting. The wildflowers swayed around them, a riot of color against the dusty brown of the surrounding desert. "Maybe it is reckless, but I've been careful and proper my entire life and it hasn't brought me any happiness. Maybe it's time to try something different." Preston sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Tell me about your life, Rosa Fletcher." "Tell me everything." So she did. Rosa found herself talking about her childhood, about her mother's quiet sadness and her father's increasing rigidity after his wife's death. She talked about the books she loved to read, borrowed from the small collection at the church. Stories about faraway places and passionate romances that seemed impossible in dusty Unionville. She talked about her dreams of seeing the ocean, of traveling to San Francisco, or even back east to cities she had only read about. Preston listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard for the first time in her life. He asked questions that showed genuine interest, not the polite but disengaged queries she was used to from the men her father invited to dinner. When she finally fell silent, Preston began to share his own story. He talked about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about the parents he had loved and lost. His voice went rough with emotion when he described finding them both dead from fever, buried them alone in the family plot, and then sold the farm because he couldn't bear to stay there without them. "I was angry for a long time," he admitted. "Angry at God, angry at the world, angry at myself for surviving when they didn't. I thought if I kept moving west, I could outrun the grief. But you can't outrun what lives inside you." "How did you make peace with it?" Rosa asked softly. "I'm not sure I have completely," Preston said. "But I've learned to carry it differently. And I've learned that grief is just love with nowhere to go. The fact that losing them hurt so much means I was lucky to have them at all." Rosa reached out impulsively and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm, and they sat there in silence for a long moment, connected by shared understanding of loss and loneliness. "I need to tell you something," Rosa said finally. "My father has arranged for another man to court me. Tom Brewer, the mine owner's son. He's coming to call on me this evening." She felt Preston's hand tense in hers. "Do you want him to court you?" "No, but my father doesn't care what I want. He sees Tom as a good match because of his money and position." Preston was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "What if I came to call on you properly? What if I asked your father's permission to court you?" Rosa's heart leaped at the suggestion, but reality quickly reasserted itself. He'd never approve. "You're a ranch hand, Preston. My father wants someone established, someone wealthy." "I have money saved," Preston said. "Not a fortune, but enough. I've been working for 5 years, living simply, saving most of what I earn. I've been thinking about buying my own land, starting my own small ranch. I just haven't had a reason to do it until now." "You can't append your whole life for someone you just met," Rosa protested, even as hope bloomed in her chest. Preston shifted to face her fully, both of his hands now holding hers. "Rosa, I know this sounds crazy. I know we only met yesterday. But I've spent 5 years drifting from place to place, working jobs that meant nothing beyond a paycheck, talking to nobody about anything that matters. And then I saw you in this meadow. And for the first time since my parents died, I felt like I had a reason to build something permanent. You asked me to pick you, just by being who you are." Rosa felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different from the frustrated tears she had fought back with her father. These came from being seen, from being valued not for what she could provide but for who she was. "What do we do?" She whispered. "Let me try," Preston said. "Let me come to your father and make my case. If he refuses, then we'll figure something else out, but give me a chance to do this right." Rosa thought about Tom Brewer coming to call that evening, about the cold calculation in his eyes when he looked at her. She thought about her father's determination to marry her off to someone suitable. And she thought about Preston's blue eyes and honest smile, about the way he made her feel both safe and exhilarated at once. "All right," she said. "Try." Preston leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, gentle and reverent. "I won't let you down." They spent another hour in the meadow, talking about smaller things now, learning each other's favorite colors and foods and memories. Preston told her about his horse, a sorrel gelding named Copper who had more personality than most people. Rosa told him about her secret love of painting, how she would sneak out before dawn sometimes to capture the way the light hit the mountains. When the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they reluctantly parted ways. Preston promised to come to the store the next day, and Rosa walked back to town feeling like she was floating above the dusty road. Tom Brewer arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, dressed in an expensive suit and carrying flowers that looked like they had been ordered from somewhere far away rather than picked from the local landscape. Rosa received him in the parlor while her father hovered nearby, beaming with approval. "Miss Fletcher," Tom said, bowing slightly as he presented the flowers. "You look lovely this evening." "Thank you, Mr. Brewer," Rosa said, taking the flowers without enthusiasm. They were roses, hothouse-grown and perfect, but they smelled like nothing compared to the wildflowers in her room. They sat on opposite ends of the horsehair sofa while her father positioned himself in a nearby chair, determined to supervise the proceedings. Tom made small talk about the weather and the mine's productivity, his voice smooth and practiced. He had clearly done this before, courting women with calculated charm. "I've been thinking, Miss Fletcher, that Unionville needs more culture and refinement," Tom said. "When I take over my father's business interests, I plan to build a proper house, something worthy of San Francisco. I'll need a wife who can help me entertain important guests, someone with grace and beauty." Rosa noticed that he spoke about needing a wife the way someone might speak about needing furniture, a necessary component for the life he was building. There was no warmth in his words, no genuine interest in who she was beyond her ability to fulfill a role. "That sounds very planned out," Rosa said carefully. "I believe in planning, Miss Fletcher. Success doesn't happen by accident." Tom leaned slightly closer, and Rosa caught the scent of expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the smell of cigars. "Your father tells me you're an accomplished young woman. I appreciate that. I have no patience for silly, frivolous girls." Rosa wanted to ask what he did have patience for, but she bit her tongue. Her father was watching with such hope in his eyes that she felt guilty for her lack of interest in Tom Brewer. The visit lasted exactly 1 hour, after which Tom announced that he had business to attend to the next day but would call again at the end of the week. He kissed Rosa's hand in farewell, his lips cold and dry against her skin. After he left, her father practically crowed with delight. "See. A perfect gentleman. He's exactly the kind of man who can give you a good life, Rosa." "He talked about me like I was a piece of property," Rosa said quietly. "He talked about you with respect and clear intentions," her father corrected. "That's more than most women get. You should be grateful for his interest." Rosa went to bed that night feeling trapped and anxious. She had agreed to let Preston try, but what if her father refused even to consider him? What if Tom Brewer's wealth and position made Preston's honest work seem insignificant by comparison? Sleep came in fragments, troubled by dreams of being locked in a beautiful house that felt like a prison. The next morning, Rosa was measuring out coffee beans for a customer when the bell above the store door chimed. She looked up and felt her heart skip as Preston walked in, dressed in clean clothes with his hat in his hands. He had clearly made an effort, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished, but he still carried himself with that easy, natural grace that no amount of money could buy. Her father looked up from the counter, his expression instantly suspicious. "Help you with something?" "Yes, sir," Preston said, his voice steady and respectful. "My name is Preston Thorne. I work at the McAllister Ranch north of town. I was hoping I could speak with you about a personal matter." James Fletcher's eyes narrowed. "What personal matter would a ranch hand have with me?" Preston glanced at Rosa, and she saw determination in his expression. "I'd like permission to court your daughter, sir." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Rosa watched her father's face turn red, saw his hands clench into fists on the counter. "You've got nerve, boy," her father said, his voice low and threatening. "Coming into my store asking to court my daughter when you've got nothing to offer her but a cowboy's wages." "I have savings, sir," Preston said calmly. Enough to buy land and start my own ranch. I'm a hard worker and I'm honest. I may not be wealthy, but I'd treat your daughter with the respect and affection she deserves." "Respect and affection don't put food on the table," her father snapped. "My daughter has a suitor, a real one who can give her security and standing in this community. She doesn't need some drifter filling her head with romantic nonsense." Rosa felt anger rise in her chest, hot and overwhelming. "Papa, I should have a say in this." "You'll stay out of this, Rosa," her father said without looking at her. "No," Rosa said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I won't stay out of it. It's my life, my future. Preston is a good man and he's asking properly, respectfully. The least you could do is consider it." Her father turned to her with fury in his eyes. "You've been sneaking around with him, haven't you? That's why you've been going to that meadow. I should have known." "We've talked, that's all," Rosa said, refusing to back down even as her voice shook. "And in those conversations, I felt more valued and understood than I have in any of the so-called proper courtships you've arranged." "Get out of my store," her father said to Preston, his voice like iron. "And stay away from my daughter. If I catch you sniffing around her again, I'll have you run out of this territory." Preston's jaw clenched, but he nodded once. "I'm sorry to have troubled you, sir." He looked at Rosa, and in his eyes she saw an apology and a promise. Then he turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind him. Rosa felt something break inside her chest, a dam giving way to a flood of emotion. "How could you?" she asked her father, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How could you dismiss him without even considering what I want?" "What you want is to throw away your future on a cowboy with pretty words and empty pockets," her father said harshly. "I'm protecting you from your own foolishness. You're protecting yourself from having to admit that I'm not a child anymore," Rosa shot back. "That I have the right to choose my own path. You'll live under my roof, you'll abide by my rules," her father said. "And you'll accept Tom Brewer's courtship with gratitude. Now get upstairs. I don't want to look at you right now." Rosa fled to her room, her body shaking with anger and heartbreak. She looked at the wildflowers on her windowsill, already wilting in the summer heat, and felt like they represented everything dying inside her. She spent the rest of the day in her room, refusing to come down even when her father called her for supper. As darkness fell, she sat by her window and stared out at the desert landscape, wondering where Preston was and what he was thinking. A soft tap on her window made her jump. She looked down and saw Preston standing below, barely visible in the shadows. Her heart lurched as she carefully opened the window. "What are you doing here?" she whispered urgently. "If my father catches you, he'll make good on his threat." "I had to see you," Preston said quietly. "I had to know you're all right." Rosa felt tears threaten again. "I'm not all right. He won't even consider you, Preston. He's determined that I marry Tom Brewer." "Then don't marry him," Preston said. "Come with me, Rosa. Leave tonight. We'll go to Carson City, get married, start our life together." The proposal shocked her into silence. Elope. Run away in the middle of the night like a common thief. It went against everything she had been taught about propriety and duty. But what had propriety and duty brought her except misery, and a future with a man who saw her as an ornament? "I need time to think," Rosa said. "This is a huge decision, Preston. If I leave like this, my father might never forgive me." "I know," Preston said, and she heard the pain in his voice. "I'm not asking you to make this choice lightly, Rosa. But I am asking you to choose yourself, choose your own happiness. I'll be waiting at the old oak tree at the north end of town at midnight. If you come, we'll leave together and build the life we both want. If you don't come, I'll understand, but I'll always wonder what we could have been." He disappeared into the darkness before she could respond, leaving Rosa trembling by the window. She closed it carefully and sank onto her bed, her mind spinning with impossible choices. Stay and marry Tom Brewer, live a life of security and suffocation. Or go with Preston, risk everything for a chance at genuine love and freedom. Rosa thought about her mother, about the sadness she had carried until it killed her. She thought about the wildflowers growing free in the meadow, about Preston's words that he was growing wild and needed someone to pick him. She thought about the way her heart had come alive when she was with him, how for the first time in her life she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The decision crystallized with surprising clarity. She had been living for other people her entire life. Maybe it was time to live for herself. Rosa moved quietly around her room, packing her few precious belongings into a carpet bag. She put in her mother's locket, the watercolor paints she had saved for, a few practical items of clothing. She changed into her most sensible dress and sturdy boots. Then she sat down and wrote a letter to her father, her hand shaking as she formed the words. Papa, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I know you'll be angry, and I'm sorry for that pain. But I cannot marry Tom Brewer, and I cannot continue living a life that feels like a slow death of everything I am. Preston Thorne is a good man who sees me as a whole person, not just a means to social standing or a pretty ornament for his house. I love him, Papa, and he loves me. We're going to build a life together, one based on mutual respect and genuine affection. I hope someday you'll understand and forgive me. I hope you'll realize that I did this not out of disrespect for you, but out of respect for myself. Mama lived her whole life doing what was expected, and I don't think she was ever truly happy. I don't want that for myself. Please take care of yourself. I'll write when we're settled. Your daughter, Rosa. She placed the letter on her pillow where her father would find it in the morning. Then she sat by the window, watching the stars wheel across the sky, waiting for midnight. When the old clock in the hallway chimed 12 times, Rosa picked up her carpet bag, took one last look at the room that had been her entire world, and crept down the stairs. The floorboards creaked under her feet, and she froze, heart hammering, waiting for her father's voice. But the house remained silent. She slipped out the back door and made her way through the dark streets of Unionville. The town slept around her, quiet except for the distant sound of piano music from one of the saloons. The moon hung high and bright, lighting her path. The old oak tree stood at the edge of town, a massive presence that had survived decades of drought and storms. Rosa saw Preston's silhouette beneath it, and beside him was a horse with 2 saddles. He turned as she approached, and even in the moonlight she could see the relief and joy that transformed his face. "You came," he said, pulling her into his arms. Rosa buried her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of him, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her cheek. "I chose myself. I chose us." Preston pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands. "I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret this choice, Rosa Fletcher." Then he kissed her, and it was nothing like the cold press of Tom Brewer's lips on her hand. This was warmth and passion and promise, a joining that felt like coming home after a long journey. They rode north through the night, taking turns on Preston's horse Copper, while leading a second horse Preston had borrowed from the McAllister ranch with a promise to return it. The landscape rolled past them, silver and strange in the moonlight, the mountains standing like sentinels against the star-filled sky. As dawn broke over the eastern peaks, painting the world in shades of gold and rose, they stopped to rest near a creek. Rosa was exhausted but exhilarated, her body aching from the long ride but her spirit soaring with freedom. "Carson City is about 2 days' ride from here," Preston said, helping her down from Copper. "We can rest for a few hours, then push on." I want to get you somewhere safe before your father comes looking." "Do you think he will?" Rosa asked. Preston's expression was grim. "I think he'll be angry enough to try. But by the time he figures out where we've gone, we'll be married, and there won't be anything he can do about it." They rested in the shade of cottonwood trees, Preston keeping watch while Rosa dozed fitfully against his shoulder. When the sun climbed higher, they ate the provisions Preston had packed and continued their journey. The landscape changed as they traveled, the desert giving way to slightly greener valleys and rolling hills. They passed other travelers on the road, mostly miners and freight wagons, and Preston always positioned himself protectively beside Rosa. On the second evening, they reached the outskirts of Carson City. The territorial capital was larger and busier than Unionville, with proper streets and substantial buildings. Preston found them a boarding house run by a kind-faced widow who asked no questions when Preston requested 2 separate rooms. "We'll be married tomorrow," Preston explained to Rosa as they stood in the hallway between their doors. "Tonight, you rest properly in your own room." "I want to do this right, Rosa. I want you to know that I respect you completely." Rosa felt a wave of love for this man who could have taken advantage of the situation, but instead chose to honor her even in the middle of their scandalous elopement. She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "Thank you for being exactly who you are, Preston Thorne." The next morning they stood before a circuit judge in a small office that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. Rosa wore her best dress, wrinkled from the journey, with wildflowers in her hair that Preston had picked that morning. Preston wore his cleanest shirt and had shaved carefully, his blue eyes bright with emotion. "Do you, Preston Thorne, take Rosa Fletcher to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the judge asked. "I do," Preston said, his voice firm and clear. "And do you, Rosa Fletcher, take Preston Thorne to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Rosa thought about the life she was leaving behind, about her father's anger and the scandal that would rock Unionville. Then she looked at Preston, at the man who saw her and valued her for exactly who she was, and felt nothing but certainty. "I do," she said. The judge pronounced them husband and wife, and Preston kissed her with such tenderness that Rosa felt tears slip down her cheeks. They were good tears, tears of joy and relief, and the overwhelming emotion of starting a completely new chapter of life. Preston had arranged for them to stay at the boarding house for a week while he took care of business. Rosa learned that he had not been exaggerating about his savings. He had over $2,000, a substantial sum that represented 5 years of careful frugality and planning. "I always knew I was saving for something," Preston told her as they sat together in the boarding house parlor. "I just didn't know it was for this, for you, for our future together." They spent those days planning their next steps. Preston wanted to return to the Unionville area because he knew the land and had connections there, but they agreed that settling right in town would be too difficult with Rosa's father nearby. Instead, Preston began investigating parcels of land to the west, in the foothills where there was water and grazing for cattle. Rosa wrote a letter to her father, telling him she was married and safe, but offering no apology for her choice. She sent it with mixed emotions, hoping that time would soften his anger but fearing she might have lost him forever. At the end of the week, Preston found what he had been looking for. A rancher about 20 miles west of Unionville was selling a parcel of land with a small cabin and a creek running through it. The price was fair, and Preston negotiated carefully, using every bit of skill he had learned working cattle for 5 years. They left Carson City as husband and wife, traveling together now without fear or secrecy. The land Preston had purchased sat in a valley between rolling hills, with good grass and scattered stands of trees. The cabin was rough and small, just 2 rooms, but it had a solid roof and a stone fireplace. "It's not much," Preston said as they stood looking at their new home. "But it's ours, Rosa. We can build onto it, make it into something better." Rosa looked at the cabin, at the wild landscape surrounding it, at the creek sparkling in the afternoon sun. She thought about the house her father would have wanted her to live in as Tom Brewer's wife, large and impressive but cold and empty. This cabin might be small and rough, but it represented freedom and love and a future they would build together. "It's perfect," she said. They moved in that same day, sweeping out the dust and airing out the musty rooms. Preston had purchased basic supplies in Carson City, and Rosa set about making the cabin livable while Preston rode to the McAllister ranch to return the borrowed horse and give his notice. When Preston returned, he found Rosa had transformed the cabin. She had hung curtains made from fabric she had brought from Carson City, arranged their few belongings to maximize the small space, and even picked wildflowers for the table. The fireplace glowed with a cooking fire, and something that smelled delicious simmered in a pot. "Welcome home," Rosa said, and the words felt like magic. That night, they consummated their marriage in the small bedroom of their cabin, learning each other with tenderness and passion. Rosa had been nervous, her knowledge of marital relations limited to vague warnings and clinical descriptions, but Preston was patient and gentle, making sure she felt cherished and safe. Afterwards, they lay tangled together on the narrow bed, Preston's arms wrapped around her. "I love you, Rosa Thorne," he whispered against her hair. Rosa turned to face him, marveling at the way the moonlight through the window painted his features in silver. "I love you too. I think I started loving you the moment you said you were growing wild and needed someone to pick you." "I'll never stop being grateful that you picked me," Preston said. The next weeks passed in a blur of hard work and deep happiness. Preston worked from dawn to dusk, repairing fences and outbuildings, clearing land, and beginning to build a small herd of cattle with the money he had left. Rosa turned the cabin into a real home, sewing new curtains and quilts, planting a garden, learning to cook over the temperamental fireplace. They had neighbors, other ranchers scattered across the valley, and Rosa gradually made friends with the other women. Most were kind and welcoming, though a few turned up their noses at the story of Rosa's elopement. Rosa found she didn't care. She was too happy, too fulfilled by her new life to worry about the judgment of strangers. One afternoon, about 2 months after they had settled in the cabin, Rosa was hanging laundry when she saw a rider approaching. Her heart clenched when she recognized her father's horse. James Fletcher dismounted and stood looking at her, his face unreadable. "Papa," Rosa said quietly. "I've been looking for you," her father said. "Took me a while to track you down. Your husband covered your trail well." Rosa lifted her chin. "I'm married, Papa, legally and properly. There's nothing you can do to change that." "I know," her father said, and his voice was tired rather than angry. "I didn't come to change anything, Rosa. I came to see if you're all right." The admission surprised her. Rosa had expected rage or demands, not concern. "I'm all right. I'm more than all right, actually. I'm happy." Her father looked around at the modest cabin, at the laundry flapping in the breeze, at the garden Rosa had coaxed from the hard ground. "This is what you wanted, this rough life. This is what I chose," Rosa said. "And yes, it's rough sometimes and the work is hard, but it's my life, Papa. Mine and Preston's. We're building something together, something that matters to both of us." James Fletcher was silent for a long moment. Then his shoulders sagged. "Your mother would have been proud of you. She never had the courage to choose her own path. She did what was expected, married who she was told to marry, and I think it killed something inside her." Rosa felt tears burn behind her eyes. You knew she was unhappy. I knew, her father said heavily. And I told myself it didn't matter, that duty and security were more important than happiness. But when she died, I realized how empty our life together had been, how little joy there was. I didn't want that for you, Rosa, but I also didn't know how to want anything else. Oh, Papa, Rosa said, moving to embrace him. Her father's arms came around her stiffly at first, then tightened. I'm sorry, he said roughly. I'm sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry I tried to force you into the same prison your mother lived in. They stood there in the yard, holding each other and crying, while the wind carried the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth. When they finally pulled apart, Rosa saw that her father looked older but also lighter, as if admitting his mistakes had lifted a weight from his shoulders. Preston rode up shortly after, his expression wary when he saw James Fletcher, but Rosa's father extended his hand. I owe you an apology, son, James said. I judged you without knowing you, and I tried to keep you from my daughter for all the wrong reasons. Preston shook his hand cautiously. I love your daughter, sir. I'll spend my life making sure she's happy and cared for. I can see that, James said, looking around at the improvements Preston had made to the property. You're a hard worker and you've got integrity. That matters more than money, though it took me losing my daughter to figure that out. They invited James to stay for supper, and Rosa served the beef stew she had been simmering all day. The conversation was awkward at first, years of conflict and hurt not easily bridged, but gradually it grew easier. James told them about Unionville, about Tom Brewer's fury when he learned Rosa had eloped, about the gossip that had swirled through town. Most of it has died down now, James said. People found other things to talk about, and Tom Brewer found another girl to pursue, a banker's daughter from Virginia City. Rosa felt relief that she was no longer the center of scandal. Will you come visit again, Papa? If you'll have me, James said. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'd like to be part of your life if you'll allow it. You're my father, Rosa said. Of course I'll allow it. James stayed the night, sleeping in the cabin's front room, and left the next morning with promises to return. Rosa watched him ride away, feeling like something broken had begun to heal. The seasons turned, summer giving way to the cool brilliance of autumn in Nevada. Preston's small herd grew, and he proved to have a real talent for ranching. Rosa discovered she was pregnant in November, and Preston's joy was so profound that he picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests. We're going to have a baby, he kept saying, wonder in his voice. A child, Rosa. A family. Rosa's father visited more frequently as her pregnancy progressed, bringing gifts and advice, and slowly rebuilding the relationship that his stubbornness had nearly destroyed. He was there when Rosa went into labor on a cold March evening in 1877, pacing outside the cabin while the midwife and two neighbor women attended to Rosa. Preston held Rosa's hand through the long hours of labor, his face pale but his presence steady and reassuring. When their son was finally born, squalling and perfect, Preston wept openly. He's beautiful, Preston said, cradling the tiny bundle with infinite care. He looks just like you, Rosa. He has your eyes, Rosa said, exhausted but radiant, blue as the sky. They named him Patrick James Thorne, honoring Rosa's father and giving their son a strong name to grow into. James Fletcher held his grandson with shaking hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. Thank you, he whispered to Rosa. Thank you for giving me this gift, even after everything. The years that followed were full of hard work and deep satisfaction. Preston expanded the ranch gradually, always careful not to overextend their resources. Rosa raised Patrick and kept their home, and in 1879 gave birth to twin girls they named Ruth and Rebecca. Their cabin grew with additions Preston built himself, becoming a proper house with enough room for their growing family. Rosa never stopped painting, capturing the landscape she loved on whatever surfaces she could find. Preston built her a small studio room where she could work undisturbed, and her paintings began to attract attention from visitors to the area. A merchant from Carson City offered to sell some of her work, and Rosa found herself earning money from something she had once only done in secret. Patrick grew into a sturdy boy who loved the ranch and followed his father everywhere. The twins were bright and curious, full of questions about everything they saw. Rosa taught them to read from her precious books, and Preston taught them about the land and animals. James Fletcher became a fixture at the ranch, visiting at least once a month and forming a close bond with his grandchildren. He had sold the store in Unionville and moved to a small house closer to Rosa and Preston's ranch, wanting to spend his remaining years near the family he had nearly lost. One summer evening in 1883, Rosa and Preston sat on the porch they had built onto the front of their house, watching their children play in the yard. Patrick was 9 now, teaching his 6-year-old sisters how to braid rope. The sun was setting behind the western hills, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked quietly. "Leaving everything behind, taking such a risk?" Rosa turned to look at her husband. 7 years of ranching had weathered his face and put silver in his hair at the temples, but his blue eyes were still as bright as the day she had met him in the meadow. He was a good man, a good father, and she loved him more deeply than she had thought possible to love another person. "Never," she said. "Not for a single moment. This life, this family, you, these children, this home we built together, it's everything I didn't know I was allowed to want." Preston pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I still remember you standing in that meadow with your basket of wildflowers. I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. And then you picked me, Rosa. You chose me when you could have had a much easier life." "I chose love," Rosa said. "I chose freedom and partnership and building something real. That will always be the right choice." Patrick called out to them then, wanting to show off his rope braiding skills, and they went down to join their children in the yard. As Rosa laughed at Patrick's antics and helped the twins with their knots, she thought about the girl she had been, standing in that meadow and feeling trapped by expectations and duty. That girl had made the bravest choice of her life when she decided to pick the wildflower cowboy, who said he was growing untamed and needed someone to see his value. That choice had led to this moment, to this beautiful chaos of family and love and purpose. The years continued to pass in the pleasant rhythm of ranch life. The children grew and changed, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Patrick proved to have his father's skill with cattle and his mother's artistic eye, able to see the beauty in the harsh landscape. Ruth was bold and adventurous, always climbing trees and riding horses faster than anyone thought safe. Rebecca was quieter, preferring books and helping her mother in the garden, but with a core of steel that surprised anyone who mistook her gentleness for weakness. Rosa's father passed away peacefully in the winter of 1888, surrounded by his daughter, her husband, and his 3 grandchildren. His last words were an apology to his late wife and a thanks to Rosa for teaching him what really mattered in life. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, where the wildflowers would bloom every spring. Preston and Rosa added another room to their house, and then another, as their children grew and needed more space. The ranch prospered, not making them wealthy by any means, but providing a comfortable life and the satisfaction of honest work. They hired a few ranch hands as the operation expanded, and Preston became known throughout the region as a fair and knowledgeable cattleman. Rosa's paintings gained more recognition, and she had a small but steady income from her art. She used the money to buy books for her children and paints for herself, and to help neighbors who fell on hard times. She never forgot what it felt like to have her choices restricted, and she worked to make sure other women in the area had opportunities to learn and grow. In 1891, when Patrick was 17, he announced his intention to attend college in California to study engineering. Preston and Rosa were surprised but supportive, proud that their son wanted to pursue education beyond what they could provide. "I'll come back," Patrick promised them the day he left. "I want to see the world and learn new things, but this ranch, this land, it's in my blood. I'll come back and help build it into something even better." The twins were 13 then, and watching their brother leave made them more aware of the wider world beyond the ranch. Ruth declared she wanted to learn to be a veterinarian, unheard of for a woman but fitting her passionate nature. Rebecca wanted to be a teacher, to help other children discover the joy of reading that had transformed her own life. Preston and Rosa encouraged all of these dreams, remembering how precious it was to have the freedom to choose your own path. They had built their life on that principle, and they wanted nothing less for their children. One evening in the spring of 1895, Rosa was working in her studio when Preston came in carrying a basket of wildflowers. She was 41 now, with threads of silver in her dark hair and lines around her eyes from years of squinting in the Nevada sun. Preston was 44, his hair more silver than gold, his face weathered but still handsome. "You're collecting wildflowers," Rosa said with a smile. "I thought you might want to paint them," Preston said, setting the basket on her work table. "And I wanted to remind you of the day we met. Do you remember what I said to you?" "You said you were growing wild and asked me to pick you too," Rosa said, her heart swelling with love for this man who had given her everything by asking for nothing but herself. "Best thing I ever did," Preston said, pulling her into his arms. 19 years we've been together, Rosa, and I love you more now than I did that first day in the meadow." Rosa leaned into his embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the solid strength of his body. They had built a good life together, raised good children, weathered hardships and celebrated joys. They had proven that love based on genuine respect and partnership could thrive even in the harsh landscape of Nevada. "I love you too," Rosa said. "You're still wild, Preston Thorne, but you're mine." "Always yours," Preston promised. Patrick returned from college in 1896 with a degree in engineering and new ideas about improving water management on the ranch. He was 22 now, a man grown, and he brought with him a young woman he had met in California, a bright-eyed girl named Sarah who looked at their rough ranch house with excitement rather than disdain. "Papa, Mama, this is Sarah Chen," Patrick said proudly. "Her family immigrated from China, and she's the smartest, bravest woman I've ever met. I want to marry her, if you'll give us your blessing." Preston and Rosa looked at each other, remembering their own unconventional beginning. They looked at Sarah, seeing the determination in her eyes and the way she held Patrick's hand like it was a lifeline. "You love our son?" Rosa asked. "More than anything," Sarah said. "And I want to build a life with him, even if it means facing prejudice and hardship. We're prepared for that." "Then you have our blessing," Preston said. "Love is always worth fighting for." The wedding took place that summer in the meadow where Rosa and Preston had met 20 years earlier. The wildflowers were in full bloom, and the whole community came to celebrate, even those who whispered about Patrick marrying a Chinese woman. Rosa watched her son and his bride exchange vows and thought about how love continued to grow wild in unexpected places, needing only someone brave enough to pick it. The twins left for their own adventures in 1897. Ruth went east to study veterinary medicine at a progressive school that accepted women students. Rebecca took a teaching position in a growing town in California. The house felt empty without their noise and laughter, but Rosa and Preston took comfort in knowing their children were living lives of purpose and choice. Patrick and Sarah built a small house on the ranch property and began to expand the operation with Patrick's engineering innovations. They had their first child in 1898, a daughter they named Grace, and Rosa delighted in being a grandmother. Sarah proved to be a gifted manager, keeping meticulous records and making smart business decisions that increased the ranch's profitability. As the new century approached, Rosa and Preston found themselves entering a new phase of life. They were in their mid-40s, no longer young but not yet old, with grown children and a grandchild to spoil. The ranch was thriving under Patrick and Sarah's management, allowing Preston to step back from some of the hardest physical labor. They took more time for themselves now, riding out together to watch the sunset, sitting on their porch in the evenings and talking about everything and nothing. Preston still sometimes brought her wildflowers, and Rosa still painted the landscape she loved with undiminished passion. "We did well, didn't we?" Preston said one evening as they sat watching the sun sink behind the western mountains. "We took a wild chance, and it turned into this." Rosa looked around at the ranch they had built, the home they had created, the family they had raised. She thought about the girl she had been, trapped and desperate in Unionville, and the woman she had become through choosing love over security. "We did better than well," Rosa said. "We lived, Preston. We really lived." The new century brought changes to Nevada and to their corner of it. The old Wild West was fading, replaced by more law and order, more civilization. Unionville had nearly become a ghost town as the mines played out, but their ranch continued to thrive. Ruth came back from her studies in 1901 as the region's first female veterinarian, setting up practice in a nearby town and revolutionizing animal care. Rebecca married a fellow teacher and opened a school that welcomed students of all backgrounds. Patrick and Sarah had 2 more children, sons they named James and Thomas, and the ranch house rang again with children's laughter. Rosa and Preston built a small cottage near the main house, giving Patrick and Sarah space to raise their family while still remaining close. On a summer day in 1905, Rosa and Preston celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch, along with friends and neighbors from throughout the region. They held the celebration in the meadow where everything had begun, the same wildflowers blooming as they had 3 decades earlier. Patrick made a toast, raising his glass to his parents. "To Preston and Rosa Thorne, who taught us all that love is worth any risk, that choosing your own path is worth any struggle. They ran away together with nothing but faith in each other, and they built all of this. They built a family, a home, a legacy. They proved that growing wild isn't something to be tamed, but something to be celebrated." Rosa felt tears slip down her cheeks as Preston took her hand. They were both 51 now, their hair silver, their faces lined, their bodies marked by decades of hard work. But when Preston looked at her, Rosa still saw the lonely cowboy who had said he was growing wild and needed someone to pick him. And when Rosa looked at Preston, he still saw the girl in the meadow with her basket of wildflowers and courage enough to choose freedom. "I'd do it all again," Preston said softly, just for her. "Every moment, every struggle, every joy. I'd choose you 1,000 times over." "Only 1,000," Rosa teased, then turned serious. "I choose you infinity times, Preston Thorne. You're the best choice I ever made." They danced together as the sun set over the meadow, surrounded by the family and community they had built, swaying to music played by Patrick's children. Rosa rested her head on Preston's shoulder and felt complete contentment wash over her. The years that followed were gentle, full of the pleasures of grandparenthood and the satisfaction of seeing their children thrive. Rosa continued to paint, her work growing more accomplished and sought after. Preston mentored young ranchers, sharing the knowledge he had gained over decades of working the land. They traveled occasionally, visiting their daughters in their respective cities, marveling at how the world was changing with automobiles and electric lights. But they always came back to the ranch, to the land they had claimed together, to the home they had built with their own hands and hearts. The Wildflower Meadow remained their special place, and they visited it often, hand in hand, remembering the day their lives had changed forever. In 1915, they celebrated their 40th anniversary with a smaller gathering. All three of their children came home, now with families of their own. Ruth had married a fellow veterinarian and had 4 children. Rebecca and her husband had 5 children, all of whom loved books as much as their mother. Patrick and Sarah's 3 children were teenagers and young adults now, full of their own dreams and ambitions. Rosa and Preston sat in chairs of honor, while their children and grandchildren performed skits and songs celebrating their long marriage. Grace, Patrick's eldest daughter and now a confident 27-year-old, read a poem she had written about her grandparents' love story. She was collecting wildflowers in the meadow, Grace read. Lonely Cowboy said, "Pick me too, I'm growing wild." And she did, and from that single moment of courage and recognition, this family grew. Thank you, Grandma and Grandpa, for showing us all what real love looks like. Preston pulled Rosa close as their family applauded, and Rosa felt overwhelmed with gratitude. They had faced difficulties and hardships over the years, certainly. There had been harsh winters and drought years, illness and loss, moments of fear and uncertainty. But through it all, their love had remained constant, a foundation that everything else was built upon. "No regrets," Preston whispered to her. "None," Rosa agreed. "Only gratitude." They lived to see their grandchildren grow and begin families of their own. In 1920, Patrick and Sarah took over the ranch completely, allowing Preston and Rosa to fully retire to their cottage. Preston was 66 and Rosa 63, and while they remained active and engaged, they relished the chance to rest and simply enjoy each other's company. They spent their days reading, painting, working in Rosa's garden, and receiving visitors. Their cottage became a gathering place for grandchildren seeking advice or just wanting to hear stories about the old days. Rosa and Preston never tired of telling the story of how they met, how they chose each other, how they built their life together from nothing but love and determination. On a spring morning in 1925, Rosa woke to find Preston sitting by the window, looking out at the meadow where wildflowers were beginning to bloom. He was 71 now, still handsome despite his age, still the man whose blue eyes had captured her heart half a century earlier. "What are you thinking about?" Rosa asked, joining him by the window. "About how lucky I am," Preston said. "I could have spent my whole life drifting from place to place, working jobs that meant nothing, dying alone and forgotten. But instead I found you. You picked me, Rosa, and everything good in my life came from that." Rosa took his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strong fingers that had held hers through 5 decades. "We picked each other. That's what made it work." They sat together watching the sunrise paint the landscape in gold and rose, content in the silence that came from knowing each other so completely that words were often unnecessary. Preston died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1928, at the age of 74. Rosa woke to find him gone, his hand still clasped in hers, a slight smile on his face. The grief was profound but not bitter. They had loved each other for 52 years, raised a family together, built a legacy together. She had been blessed beyond measure. The funeral drew people from across the state, testament to the respect and affection Preston had earned. Rosa stood by his grave, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and felt both sorrow and peace. Preston had lived a good life, a full life, and he had been loved until his last breath. Rosa lived another 7 years, remaining in the cottage on the ranch, painting and gardening and spending time with her ever-growing family. She never remarried. Preston had been her great love, and she felt no desire to seek that connection with anyone else. She spent her final years writing down the story of their life together, wanting future generations to understand the courage it had taken to choose love over security, freedom over convention. She wanted them to know that growing wild wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace. On a warm June day in 1935, Rosa Fletcher Thorne died at the age of 78. Her children found her in her studio, paintbrush still in hand, a canvas before her showing the wildflower meadow where it had all begun. She had painted 2 figures in the meadow, a young woman with a basket and a cowboy holding his hat, frozen forever in the moment before their lives changed. They buried Rosa beside Preston on the hill overlooking the ranch where the wildflowers bloomed every spring. The tombstone reads simply, Preston Thorne, 1854–1928, and Rosa Fletcher Thorne, 1857–1935. Beloved parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, they grew wild together. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through Patrick's line and then his children's. The cottage where Rosa and Preston had spent their final years together became a sort of shrine, preserved as it had been when they lived there. Visitors came from far and wide to see the place where the famous Western love story had unfolded, to stand in the meadow where a lonely cowboy had asked a girl collecting wildflowers to pick him too. The story of Rosa and Preston became legend in that part of Nevada, told and retold until it took on an almost mythic quality. But those who knew them, who had witnessed their daily devotion to each other over 5 decades, knew that the reality had been even better than the legend. They had loved each other with passion and tenderness, with humor and determination, through joy and hardship. They had proven that taking a wild chance on love could lead to everything worth having. They had shown that choosing your own path, no matter how unconventional, was the only way to build a life that truly belonged to you. They had demonstrated that growing wild wasn't a flaw but a gift, something precious that needed only the right person to recognize its value. In the end, Rosa had collected Preston like one of her wildflowers, and he had bloomed in her care for more than half a century. And Preston had chosen Rosa as his partner in building a life, and she had thrived in the freedom that choice had brought her. Together, they had created something beautiful and enduring, a love that outlasted them both and inspired everyone who heard their story. The wildflowers still bloom in that Nevada meadow every spring, purple lupines and yellow balsam root and red Indian paintbrush swaying in the wind. And if you visit at sunset on a summer evening, when the light turns everything golden and the air smells of sage and possibility, you can almost see them there. A young woman with a basket and a lonely cowboy, choosing each other, choosing love, choosing to grow wild together under the vast western sky. Their descendants continue to tend the ranch, now expanded and modernized but still carrying the spirit of those 2 people who started it all with nothing but courage and love. The paintings Rosa created hang in museums and private collections throughout the West, each one a testament to her artistic vision and her love for the landscape that had given her freedom. The innovations Preston and Patrick developed for water management and sustainable ranching are still studied and implemented. But more than any physical legacy, Rosa and Preston left behind proof that love based on mutual respect, genuine partnership, and the freedom to be fully yourself could weather any storm and outlast any hardship. They showed that the wildest choice, the one that defied convention and risked everything, could also be the wisest choice, the one that led to a life of meaning and joy. Their story reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is pick the wildflower, claim what grows untamed, and build a life that honors the wild, authentic parts of ourselves. Rosa Fletcher and Preston Thorne did exactly that, and in doing so, they created a love story for the ages, one that continues to inspire and encourage anyone who hears it to choose love, choose freedom, and choose to grow wild together.